All right, today we're going to deal with some of the other issues in the aftermath of World War II and the presidency of Harry Truman. Harry Truman, as you of course remember, ascended to the presidency as the fourth vice president of Franklin Roosevelt. And so he didn't have a broad political base. The New Deal coalition is, of course, a broad and enduring sort of political union, but it's always difficult for the inheritor of a political legacy to carry on and to hold together as strongly the group of people that had followed their predecessor. I mean, you can see the challenges of that today with Joe Biden trying to bring back the Obama coalition or Hillary Clinton's failure to keep that whole coalition together. So, in the election of 1948, Truman does not have a broad base of support. Plus, he's getting challenges from both the left and the right. Wallace on the left is trying to pull Truman closer towards socialism. Henry Wallace was the self-avowed socialist, third vice president of Franklin Roosevelt, and Strom Thurmond, as a Southern conservative Democrat, is trying to pull the Democratic Party to the right. And so Harry Truman is trying to somehow plow a furrow between these two sides, and quite frankly, he fails. Uh, Harry Truman alienates the Southerners by desegregating the armed forces and alienates Henry Wallace because he's not liberal enough. And so Harry Truman has two third party challenges. The first is what's Strom Thurmond as what's called a states' right Democrat. At this point, the rights that the states are concerned about is discriminating against African Americans. Whereas back in the 1850s, the states' rights that they were concerned about was enslaving African Americans. So the more things change. So the end result, of course, is the Democratic vote is going to be split three ways, whereas the Republicans are united behind New York Governor Thomas Dewey, who we see here telling us that the United States needs you to vote for Thomas Dewey, I guess. Truman, in order to try to build up some political capital, calls a special session of Congress with the hope that he'll be able to either convince them to pass some meaningful legislation or that they'll fail to do so, in which case he can say, well, it's not my fault, Congress is incompetent. Unsurprisingly, that second one is what happens. Congress fails to pass anything. Truman campaigns on a do nothing Congress. But on the eve of the election, it's almost guaranteed that Truman's going to lose. All the polls show that Dewey's going to win. Truman's got two spoilers. He's not a particularly charismatic guy. And so the end result of all of this is everyone goes to bed thinking that Dewey has won. The newspapers even print headlines describing the fact that Dewey has now become president. And so when Truman wakes up in the morning, he's able to jubilantly pose with these pre-printed newspapers predicting his political defeat. So what happened in 1948? A couple different things. One, the way that the vote was split was not as broad as it could have been. The states' rights Democrats only took a couple of the really deep South states, not a broad Southern coalition. And Wallace and the progressives didn't appeal to the vast swath of the industrial North that they thought they would. I mean, for Truman, it means he still has a plurality of the popular vote and a bare electoral majority, but Harry Truman gets to win the presidency in his own right. Truman's signature proposal and his sort of olive branch to the progressives was something called the Fair Deal. It's pretty straightforward. It's a sweeping series of reforms, full employment, raise the minimum wage, all of this sort of stuff. It's a vast sort of array of things. And quite frankly, it fails for a couple different reasons. Part of it is it was just too big and broad. I mean, people were willing to accept massive governmental solutions when the Great Depression is happening, but now the war is over and people are questioning whether or not we want to keep doing these things. And the other part of it is that, a lot of the Democrats in Congress were on the way out at this point. Truman may have won the presidency in '48, but he lost control of Congress, and so the lame duck session was not necessarily enough to get this passed. And some of it is the fact that Truman is just not the politician FDR was. FDR was an expert at making Congress dance to his tune, and Truman never had that level of charisma. And so the Fair Deal utterly falls apart, and Truman gets no real legislative legacy. The real punch in the face to Truman is the Taft Hartley Act, which is a Republican sponsored act that significantly undermines the power of unions. So, whereas Truman's Fair Deal was trying to increase the power and prestige of the American worker, the Taft Hartley Act basically puts massive restrictions on unions. and obviously tries to keep the communists out, which we'll get more into that specifically within the next couple of days when we get into the second Red Scare. So obviously, communism is a problem, but outlawing closed shop unions is a problem for unionized workers. Closed shops means that you have to be a member of the union in order to work in this field, and it was absolutely essential for a lot of industries because if businesses could hire non-unionized workers, then it would be significantly limit the power of the union to be able to bargain. And so the Taft-Hartley Act was passed. Truman vetoes it as damaging to labor, and then Congress overrides his veto, showing that domestically Harry Truman is just dead at this point, even despite his reelection. And of course, this is to some degree a return to the increasing power of big business. Harry Truman has to deal with is the rebuilding of post war Asia. Obviously, Japan being defeated leaves a massive power vacuum throughout the region. And so there's a series of questions that Truman and his administration are going to have to tackle. One is the occupation of Japan, and so that's undertaken by Douglas MacArthur, who's, of course, our commander in the Pacific and the architect of the island hopping campaign. Japan is going to be rebuilt as a constitutional monarchy and is going to have a strictly pacifist clause put into their constitution to ensure that, again, they don't fight future aggressive wars. And the United States armed forces are going to guarantee the territorial security of the Japanese going forward. Japanese occupation is actually relatively short, only about 7 years before Japan is fully self-governing itself, which I think during the war we probably couldn't have imagined because, of course, we depicted Japan as this sort of totalitarian militaristic society, which to some degree they were. But the Japanese have an amazing capacity for adaptation. And once the military leaders in Japan were displaced, the emperor stepped in as a sort of constitutional figurehead to some degree, and the business classes in Japan rose up. And the post-war big business sort of Japanese corporations ended up sort of retooling Japanese society, and the Japanese put themselves back together relatively quickly. I mean, this isn't to say that the first couple of years weren't incredibly unpleasant, but the Japanese were self-governing by 52 because, quite frankly, a series of issues happened that distracted the United States and prevented us from uh, putting as much energy into the rebuilding of Japan as we otherwise would have. The big issue for us is the starting of the Chinese Civil War. We had, of course, supported the Chinese nationalists and this divide between the Kuomintang and the Chinese communists that had sort of broken out into hostility after the Shanghai massacre in 1927 had been to some degree put on hold during the Japanese invasion. We, of course, we had hoped that the nationalists would take over and occupy the areas in which the Japanese had abandoned. But unfortunately, the communists were much more adept at fighting the Japanese, and being so close to the Soviet Union, were getting tons of aid from the communists. And so, in the end, the Truman administration decided to stop backing the nationalists. Admittedly, Chiang Kai shek and his nationalists probably would have lost anyway, but Truman decides to not intervene as strongly on behalf of the nationalists because the nationalists had become so discredited with Chinese people, plus had become so corrupt that he didn't think there was any way they could win. And so Chiang Kai shek ends up retreating to Taiwan, and the Civil War is won by Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communists. And in 1949, China becomes the People's Republic of China, whereas Taiwan becomes the Republic of China, a divide that exists still to this day. So Mao, of course, is able to seize power and becomes a cult hero slash figurehead. Well, he becomes the absolute ruler of China for a while, and now China is communist, which makes us see, quite uncomfortable, as I would imagine you would be able to guess. So Mao is going to rebuild Chinese society in the sort of with the sort of command economy of the USSR through a series of structured 5-year plans, and of course a series of disastrous attempts like the Great Leap Forward. And he is going to become again the central leader of China. This freaks us out because it's this we create this idea called domino theory, which is the idea that one nation falling to communism means that a series of other nations will also topple. And we're worried that China falling to communism is the first step towards communism taking over all of Asia. This domino theory is going to be sort of our pervading metaphor for most of the Cold War, with the idea that how do you stop dominoes from falling over? Well, you need to at some point hold the dominoes up, lest all of Asia become communist. So that brings us to, of course, Korea. The Korean peninsula had been occupied by the Japanese going all the way back to 1910. And so, with the Japanese immediately withdrawing, there's a huge power vacuum in Korea. At the Yalta Conference, we decided that Korea would be partitioned among the 38th parallel, and much like Stalin was going to rebuild Eastern Europe, Stalin would rebuild North Korea, and the United States would be responsible for rebuilding South Korea. So there's also some Truman, of course, was much more hesitant about this and much less friendly about this at Potsdam, but the agreement had already been made. And there's some speculation that one of the reasons that Truman used the atomic bomb on Japan to end the war as quickly as he did was that he was hoping to prevent a sort of similar partition of Japan because the Soviet Union was gearing up to join the war in the Pacific and potentially invade. So here's your divide. Korea is now partitioned into a communist built North Korea and a capitalist built South Korea. The capitalist South Korea is a military dictatorship, whereas the communist rebuilt North Korea is a military dictatorship, but a communist military dictatorship, not a capitalist military dictatorship. And that's, of course, a very important distinction for us. The leader of the North Korea has always been the Kim family. This is Kim Il Sung, who is the founder of the Kim dynasty and the founding father of North Korea. And the Korean War begins with Kim's invasion of South Korea. So North Korean troops invade because, of course, neither of the Korean states recognizes the other's sovereignty and right to control the Korean peninsula. Both of them claim to be the legitimate government of Korea, and so North Korea, with the tacit sort of backing of the Soviets and maybe the prodding of the Soviets, invades South Korea with an attempt to reunify the peninsula under communism. the, the United States responds by going to the United Nations and puts together a UN task force, a peacekeeping force, to go into the Korean Peninsula and reestablish democratic is the wrong, a capitalist South Korea. And so the Korean War is actually a UN action with 21 countries contributing weapons. Of course, you'd wonder why the Soviet Union wouldn't veto this as a permanent member of the Security Council. Well, the Soviet Union at the time was boycotting the United Nations because the United Nations was still recognizing the Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek's government, not the Communist People's Republic of China. So that's why neither China nor the Soviet Union vetoed the United Nations actions. So, with Stalin's backing and the Chinese backing, the North Koreans invade the South. And I'm going to massively oversimplify this and post videos along with this lecture. But they are incredibly successful. They overrun American positions. Douglas MacArthur is caught completely unaware. He's hanging out in Japan at the time. And so the US forces in Korea were significantly overmatched and very quickly overwhelmed. Within just several months, the communists take almost all, and you can see this in this first picture here, almost all of the North Korean peninsula, all the way down to the Pusan perimeter. So, with the UN forces with their backs against the wall, Douglas MacArthur launched a daring amphibious assault, something called the Incheon landing. I'm not going to go into detail here. I'm going to post a video along with this lecture. And so the Incheon landing is a massive amphibious assault on Incheon here, halfway up the peninsula. And it was an attempt to surprise the communists, to capture the capital of Seoul, and then to use that along with an attack from the Pusan perimeter to drive the North Koreans out of South Korea. The problem with the Incheon landing, and maybe this problem is the wrong word, but it was almost too successful. And so Douglas MacArthur and Truman began to disagree about what the purpose of the Korean War was. Truman was in favor of fighting what's called a limited war in order to try to keep South Korea independent, whereas MacArthur wanted to fight a total war, unify the Korean Peninsula, and maybe even do some aggressive rollback against China. And so, as UN forces pushed north towards the Yalu River, a series of somewhat irresponsible or bellicose statements by MacArthur ended up leading the Chinese to believe that he and these UN forces were a threat to them. And so, although China never officially declared war, approximately hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers streamed into the Korean conflict and quickly stemmed the tide and then overwhelmed the UN forces. And so, just as quickly as they had advanced, the UN forces were forced back. Seoul was lost yet again, and they had to restabilize control over South Korea. From there, both sides to some degree dug in, and war became a stalemate of strategic bombing and unbelievably brutal trench warfare, more reminiscent of World War One than World War Two. Obviously, the sheer numbers that the Chinese were able to mobilize made it incredibly difficult for UN forces to push back against this. And so this is where, again, the limited war versus total war debate becomes even more fierce, because the Soviet Union was providing a sort of Air Force cover for the North Koreans, and although they did provide some sort of pushback against this, the U.S. Air Force was able to devastate the Korean Peninsula and was able to significantly bomb northern cities, but they were limited to targets in North Korea because the fear was if they attacked China, they would bring China into the war. And so this led to a debate between MacArthur and Truman, where MacArthur wanted to bomb Chinese cities and potentially use nuclear weapons in the conflict, whereas Truman tried to stick to a much more limited series of limited objectives. And so, obviously, Truman is the commander in chief, MacArthur is just a general, but MacArthur is a legendary general, whereas Truman is a somewhat he's not certainly not beloved, I guess tolerated politician. So MacArthur is the architect of victory in the Pacific. Truman is a haberdasher from Missouri. And so who should in the end be in charge of military strategy? Well, Truman decided he should. And MacArthur again started criticizing him. Uh, Truman tried to recall MacArthur back to the United States, and MacArthur refused to come. So Truman flew to the Pacific to confront him. And the end result of this whole deal is Truman became convinced that MacArthur was irresponsible and that if he was allowed to stay in command, he would violate orders and potentially push the United States into a world war against the communist nations. So, with that in mind, Truman removed MacArthur from command. He fired MacArthur, which was incredible, which was basically political suicide for Truman because MacArthur is a living legend at this point. And so, as a private citizen, MacArthur just goes on a tour, just slamming Truman and politically crushing him and criticizing him for being soft on communism. And so, with the battle between Truman and MacArthur going to Truman, the war continues to be a limited war. It drags on for 3 more years with hundreds of thousands of casualties. And in the end, an armistice is declared, and the United States can claim victory. The Korean War is kind of a complicated war to break down because, in the end, not much changed. North Korea stayed communist, South Korea stayed not communist. The actual territorial change was incredibly minute, and the human cost was absolutely brutal. I mean, when you look at how many people were killed, it was an incredibly, incredibly deadly war with huge civilian casualties, especially with the strategic bombing of North Korea. We didn't use nuclear weapons. We did use chemical weapons and traditional explosives, which killed a crazy amount of people. And in the end, the war is still technically going on. I mean, there was an armistice declared, but a standardized formal relations have not effectively been established between the two sides. And so it's still a militarized border. It's